Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 48 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. When trouble occurs, all of us naturally look for a place of refuge to hide out in until the storm passes, or at least until we can get a handle on the situation. What we're looking for, of course, is sanctuary. But in the Middle Ages, sanctuary wasn't just a vague idea of safety. It was a way for someone to legally delay trial and punishment, sometimes permanently. We often hear a lot about sanctuary in medieval movies, TV, and books, but just how did sanctuary work in the real Middle Ages? To find out, I invited Dr. Shannon McSheffrey to give us the skinny. Shannon McSheffrey is an associate professor at Concordia University, as well as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She's the author of several books, including Gender and Heresy, Women and Men in Lollard Communities, 1420 to 1530, Love and Marriage in Late Medieval London, which gave me the inspiration for a 5-Minute Medievalist post just a few weeks ago, and most recently, Seeking Sanctuary, Law, Mitigation, and Politics in English Courts, 1400 to 1550. We talked about the rules for sanctuary seekers, how it could be useful in times of political turmoil, and whether or not a really gutsy person could seek sanctuary in the church in order to avoid punishment for heresy. Well, thanks, Shannon, for joining me to talk about sanctuary. I'm really excited because I don't know much about it, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot about it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Danièle, for inviting me.
So sanctuary, I think it's one of those things, one of those words that people toss around, but it's got to be one of these things that has a very specific definition in the Middle Ages. So what is sanctuary?
Okay, you're right that it is a very, it can be quite an ambiguous word. I think that the way that we tend to think about it now is that it is a safe place. It is a place of calm. I mean, that's why spas are often called sanctuary. And that does link back to the medieval idea. So that the root of the word is really in the idea of sanctus or holy. So it is a holy place. And so in the Middle Ages, it's definitely associated with churches. Now, even in the Middle Ages, there were two kind of different meanings of it, because it could mean the area that's by the altar in the church, which is the holiest part of the church, but it also referred to the idea that churches could act as safe places, as zones of protection to which somebody who is in trouble in some way could flee. The original meaning of it relates to that idea. And so this had been something that had been around from the ancient world, the idea that in general, religious sites, and this isn't just a Christian thing, could serve as an asylum. And in particular, when somebody is in trouble with the law, that this is a place where if you were an accused criminal, you could go and shelter from arrest from authorities. And so that's the sort of basis on which the medieval idea in some way, or, in different manifestations, because it came out differently in different places, but that it kind of evolved from there.
Okay, there's one thing I want to pick up on before I kind of dig into that, and that is, you mentioned it's not just a Christian thing, and we know that medieval Europe was a place that had different religions that were intermingling and stuff, and also that in criminal trials and stuff, when you had, say, a Jewish person that was on trial, they would be swearing on the Torah. Would you have the idea of sanctuary extended from Christians to, for example, people who are Jewish who were taking sanctuary where they need to in their holy sites as well? Or was this something that only Christians applied to Christian sites?
Well, in medieval Europe, Christian authorities thought of it as something that was most definitely a Christian idea. Now, I study late medieval England, where in theory everybody was Christian because Jews had been expelled, Muslims were not really allowed. And so my own sort of practical experience from the records that I look at, it doesn't include, for instance, Jews. Now, as I'm remembering, in places like southern France, where there was the use of sanctuary sometimes, but it was not available to Jewish populations. So if you committed a homicide and you were Jewish, you didn't have the option that a Christian might to go to a church.
Okay. That was just a question I had, because I know that there were synagogues at the time, so I was just wondering if this applied to them or not.
as I know, and somebody else might be able to correct me on that, but as far as I know, I mean, sanctuary was used in 13th century England when there were Jews in England, but as far as I know, there are no examples of Jews seeking sanctuary. But one of, my colleagues who works on the earlier period might be able to leap in and in a Twitter response or something like that, point out an example.
Okay. So what kind of crimes or trouble would you get into for which you would, as a Christian person, use sanctuary? What kind of things would you be using it for?
Good question. So if we're talking about England in the 13th century, the law of felony was developing. And so a felony was, it was a crime for which you could be executed. It was a serious crime. And at that point, the connection between a crime for which you could be executed and the idea that sanctuary would be available in such a case, because the idea was that the church would help protect your life, even for the most heinous of sinners or criminals. The power of Christianity and its redemption was so great that the church could act as a protector of your life. And so there was something of an idea that you had to have committed an offense for which you would be executed. If it was a lesser offense, then sanctuary was, in theory, not really supposed to be available to you. Now, that's the theory. In practice, especially in the late Middle Ages, I find that all sorts of people who have committed or done wrongs, or even haven't done wrongs but just want protection, would go into a church and call the asylum that they were receiving there sanctuary. For instance, in the Wars of the Roses, the civil wars of the 15th century, if you were on the wrong side of a regime change, you went to sanctuary. So you were a kind of political refugee in that case. Also, debtors who were not subject to execution but could be imprisoned, also quite frequently. That was actually one of the largest groups of people who took sanctuary. So that was kind of, in a sense, breaking an original rule. But I think that one of the things about sanctuary and the way that it worked is that it evolved, that the rules kind of changed. These things were recognized as an official manifestation of sanctuary.
So,
and I think that, yeah.
Sorry. I was going to say, did people use it for situations in which they were just avoiding their neighbors' disputes? Because I thought I had come across this before, where your neighbor might be coming after you for something and you go and hide it in the church. You could use it for that as well?
That's right. I mean, and sometimes it was a lesser offense of some kind that you're just avoiding arrest, because you can be arrested for all kinds of things and to be held prior to some kind of a case. So if one of your neighbors is suing you over what we would today think of as a civil matter, then you might well be arrested beforehand to be held before trial, so that to make sure that you would show up for your court date. And so some people would flee to sanctuary in such a situation. You will also find that there's a few cases actually where people will go into a church and claim that they have committed a felony in order, in a sense, to be admitted properly into the sanctuary in the church, and then later on turn around and say that had actually been a false confession of a felony just to get into the church. And so in order to escape from enemies, as they sometimes say, who were chasing you for reasons that were about something else altogether, then you would invent perhaps a more substantial issue in order to get into a church. Yeah. So sometimes it does seem as if people were using it for all kinds of different reasons. Sometimes they did so openly. So you do see records all the time where people say, so-and-so is in sanctuary for trespass, which is, a trespass can be serious, but it's not a capital offense. And obviously the debtors are there for a non-criminal kind of situation usually. So there's all sorts of different reasons. It became quite malleable, I guess, is a way to put it. Yeah.
So my question is, people are escaping, in theory, they're escaping a capital punishment, but we know that at the same time, the church had its own crimes that it could charge you with. So what could you do if you were being charged with a church crime? So say something like fornication or adultery or something. Could you still claim sanctuary in the church? Because this is a tricky thing.
That's right. Well, I mean, first of all, for fornication and adultery, you wouldn't really need to take sanctuary because the sanction, the punishment that you would receive is actually quite mild. And so I haven't found any situations where somebody seeks sanctuary for that kind of sexual, really it was a misdemeanor, a sexual misdemeanor in terms of the way that it was dealt with by late medieval church courts. But heresy, on the other hand, now that was a serious ecclesiastical offense. Now, the church did not itself execute you for heresy. The church didn't have that power, but they could convict you of heresy and then turn you over to the royal authorities, and the royal authorities would then execute you for heresy. And we do have some cases where people go into sanctuary and claim that they are taking sanctuary for heresy. And that is a tricky thing because because most heretics reject the authority of the church. And then you say, but I want the church's protection. And there are some cases that then get brought into the royal courts asking, can this person have sanctuary for heresy? And in some cases, it's a little bit ambiguous, but there are other cases where it's very clear where the judges simply say, no, if you reject the authority of the church, you can't have, you just can't have sanctuary. And so the person is seized from sanctuary. And, in one of the cases, they had committed both felonies and were accused of heresy, and they actually in treason. And so they ended up being executed for treason. But the heresy was what allowed them to be seized from sanctuary. So they kind of had a catch-22 going on there.
I just figure whenever there's a rule, there's going to be a human being that's going to try and bend it. So
absolutely. And there's that you do see with the sanctuary seekers a kind of ingenuity, which is born out of the fact that these people are really facing death. If they are put on trial and convicted of their felony, the only punishment for felony is hanging, it's death. And this is even for a relatively small scale theft, for instance. That is a felony, and the punishment for felony is death. And so, not surprisingly, people get creative about the ways, that they try to get out of hanging. And you can really see sometimes the desperation. I mean, honestly, sometimes when you read it and you kind of roll your eyes and think, wow, that person is really trying it on. And I always try to then remind myself, well, they're trying it on, but this isn't a joke for them. This is this is life and death for them. It seems Monty Python-esque sometimes, but it really was a life and death circumstance for them.
Yeah, it reminds me of when you'd have a regular person who was a thief or something who would try and claim the right of clergy by just learning the Lord's Prayer so that they could avoid hanging. And again, like you say, it looks kind of funny in a way because you can see they're really trying, but at the same time, it is life and death. It's important.
Yeah.
So can you give us a picture of what it would look like if someone claimed sanctuary? Because they arrive at the church, and then what does the church do with them? Like, where do they house them? How do they feed them? What does it look like if someone claims it?
Okay. So there are two different forms of sanctuary that developed in England. So sanctuary had different forms in different parts of Europe. It was also ultimately, shall we say, exported to Latin America, and it actually survived longest in Latin America up until the 19th century. But in England, they had two forms that developed, first in the 13th century and then the second form really around 1400. So the first form involved parish churches. So any parish church, an accused criminal could go into the parish church and then simply, in a sense, claim sanctuary. The limitation was that they had only 40 days in the church. And so they were allowed to stay there for, almost, 6 weeks. But by the end of the 6 weeks, they had two choices. They either had to confess their felony to a coroner, who was the royal official who kind of dealt with this sort of paperwork at the county level. So the coroner for the county had to come to the church and had to hear their confession of their crime. They had to fully confess the crime. The coroner would write it down so that there was a record of that. And then the criminal would have to undertake an oath of abjuration, as it was called. And abjuration literally means to forswear or swear off of something. In this situation, they swore off the realm. In other words, they swore to go into exile. So you had to then basically say, and now I'm going to leave the kingdom forever, never to return. And so you would take an oath, you would have confessed your felony. The coroner would then administer this oath. The coroner would assign the felon a particular port from which they had to leave, so that the felon had to go from wherever that parish church was to a port where they would have to find a ship. They were supposed to find kind of on their own, although there's some suggestion that there might have been a bit of official help with this, find a ship, get on the ship, and then, quote, go overseas, which usually meant France. And then they were not supposed to not ever be allowed back into the realm again, unless the king gave them a pardon. And so, a lot of times the records that we end up seeing are the people who either didn't leave in the first place, like they were told they had to go to this port, but somewhere along the way they escaped and didn't go into exile and then were later found, or perhaps they did go into exile but then returned and then they get arrested again. Sometimes they end up getting a pardon. Actually, surprisingly frequently, they end up getting a pardon. But other times, if they've been caught back in the realm again, they are treated as a convicted criminal because they've confessed their crime and the coroner has recorded it. So a court might take the coroner's record of the confession. They ask the criminal, can you give us any excuse of why you're here? And you're not in exile. And unless they have a valid excuse, which normally they don't, unless they have a pardon, then they end up getting hanged. So that is a form of sanctuary that in contemporary terms was usually, it was called taking church. The record will say, so-and-so took the church of St. Magnus or whatever for felony. And then you'd get the record of the felony, the confession, and the note that they had abjured. So that's one form. And it began to develop, kind of as an evolution of those ancient forms of sanctuary that had been used all the way through the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages in various ways. And it evolved through the 13th century so that by 1300 it had become, quite an established system. And after the Black Death, it seems to have become disrupted, part of it related perhaps to the 100 Years' War. Obviously, there may well just have been a disruption that related to the tremendous mortality of the Black Death. And so it becomes more rare in the late 14th century and at the beginning of the 15th century. So some historians had assumed that it kind of died at that point. But one of the things that my research showed is that is something that people had known about, but I think understanding really the chronology of how it developed, that around 1400 or so, another form of sanctuary developed. And that is that in monasteries, certain monasteries in the realm, there were a whole bunch of them that ended up being used, but there were maybe about 7 or 8 main ecclesiastical institutions. Most of them were monasteries, but one of them was a cathedral, Durham Cathedral. Another one, a couple of them actually were what we call collegiate churches, which are similar to monasteries, technically slightly different, but they are all religious institutions of a kind of substantial nature that would have a large church, that would have a precinct around the church that was relatively substantial. And those institutions began to offer felons permanent sanctuary so that you could just go into these monastic precincts and you would not have to abjure the realm after 40 days. You could just stay in the precinct, for a time unlimited. Entry in that case was different, that you would come, At Durham Cathedral, for instance, where we have more information about this, you would go into the church and you would ring the bell. There would be some kind of a rope that was, hanging down, and you would ring the bell, and then that would tell the cathedral clergy that you were seeking sanctuary. They would come, and then you would have to confess your sin. Well, it's kind of like confessing a sin. You confess your felony to the cathedral officials, and they would write it down in a register, and then you would become what was known as a sanctuary man. Very, very, very occasionally sanctuary woman. It was very male dominated, but that would then allow you to stay there permanently.
If you became a sanctuary man, is this kind of like in modern times where someone, I'm thinking of Julian Assange actually, who will take sanctuary in an embassy but cannot set foot outside of this embassy? Is this the same type of thing where they'd have to stay within that boundary, or they would be immediately arrested if they stepped outside?
And
okay.
In fact, there are some really quite interesting stories about that whole question of like literally stepping a foot out of the boundary. There was one sanctuary that was actually in the middle of the city of London. It was just north of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was at a collegiate church that was called St. Martin le Grand. There's still a street that's called St. Martin le Grand, which is, where it was. It's near the St. Paul's tube stop actually now. And so in that precinct, that was one of the it was one of the earliest and one of the more important sanctuaries in the realm. And because it was in the middle of a city, it actually had a very precise boundary that there was actually a big court case about. And so there was a lot of testimony about the precise nature of the boundaries. And one of the stories that they told was that there was a tavern that was just like literally on the other side of the boundary. And the sanctuary men liked to go into the tavern to drink. And there was a back room of the tavern that the wall was on the boundary. And so the story was that if you could stand in that that was called the sanctuary parlor, what it was called, a back room at the tavern, and you could stand in the sanctuary parlor, and as long as you had your hand on the back wall, then you would be accounted to be in sanctuary, and you could presumably have one hand on the wall and your other hand has your pint glass, so to speak. And so it was disputed actually whether or not that really was in sanctuary. And there were cases apparently where sanctuary men were in fact arrested when they were in this room. But it really was a kind of it. There was testimony about how as long as your hand was within boundary or your foot was within the boundary, then they could get you. It was kind of like tag. I don't know if you remember about, like if you had your hand on home base, then you were safe. But if you put your hand off, so you do have this sort of vision of, of people kind of waiting around to see, will this sanctuary man actually step out of the boundary? But if you did step out of the boundary, absolutely, you were liable to be arrested. There's another quite amusing story about a man who was in a parish church sanctuary, and he had an unfortunate situation, let's just say, with his bowels, where he really felt as if he needed a toilet, and he didn't want to use the churchyard because he didn't want to defile the churchyard, he said, at least later. And so there were, actually, this was again in London, and there were a set of actual public toilets effectively about 200 meters away. And so he said that he went out of the churchyard to these public toilets to use them. And then it's actually not clear if it's on the way there or on the way back. But anyway, and he was arrested for being outside the churchyard. And he claimed, that really this was unfair. Honestly, at this moment, I can't remember how that one turned out, whether this was accepted as an excuse. I mean, it's, in these situations, it's also, not clear the extent to which people are inventing these excuses, whether they're real. I mean, when you're reading the record. But you had to be very strict about staying within the boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think about this stuff being just so interesting because it's so complex how people will try and figure out the rules for this. And I think it's really important to talk about because I think that we do imagine watching movies and stuff like that, that if you were charged with a crime, that was it, you're executed. But obviously, people are hearing you out. Like, what is your excuse? So
Yeah.
that we can write it down. We don't want to step on your rights. What
Yeah.
tell us what's going on. I was trying to think about, speaking of TV, I think that probably the biggest or best example we see of people taking sanctuary is in that series on the White Queen, where you see Elizabeth
Mhm.
Woodville and her children taking
Yes.
sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. And that's a really interesting one because the entire country is watching whether Richard III is going to come and take them out of
Yeah.
sanctuary. So
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit about that case? What
Okay,
happened there?
that is a very actually, in general, there were a lot, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what I would call political refugees from the Wars of the Roses on both sides. So Lancastrians also went into sanctuary, and then you do have these really big examples of Queen Elizabeth Woodville twice taking sanctuary, first in 1470-71. And she actually gave birth to her oldest son inside the sanctuary. And then later, after the death of her husband, where she goes into sanctuary with most of her children, as you're pointing out, and Richard III, who has just usurped the throne or is about to usurp the throne, is trying to get the younger of the two princes out. Now, those situations, I think, are extremely important for the development, what I would call the late flowering of sanctuary. So actually, after those situations, sanctuary, the use of sanctuary and in a sense, actually even the legal acceptance of sanctuary in the royal courts grows during the period between the 1480s and the early 1530s, I think. And that's, I think, partly because sanctuary ended up being seen as a remedy for tyranny. And it is partly because of the fact that Richard III was trying to grab people out of sanctuary. Richard III ends up, rightly or wrongly, personally I think rightly, being seen as a horrible tyrant in the early Tudor period. And so one of the things that Henry VII actually goes out of his way to kind of refer to sanctuary as this positive force that is a tool against corruption, a tool against tyranny. You know, if you feel that in some way the system isn't dealing with you rightfully, sanctuary is seen as the place that you can go to. And so one of the things that ends up doing is that it gives sanctuary this kind of idea of being a place where you can get real justice, which sometimes is not the same as what's being meted out in the royal courts, and the fact that both sides in these civil wars were using sanctuary as a safe haven in this way was a really important kind of development, it seems to me, in allowing a quite positive view of sanctuary. Now, as for what happened actually in that particular situation, Elizabeth was persuaded to surrender her younger son, and this is what we tend to think, because she gambled that cooperating with Richard would, have a better outcome than trying to resist him. I mean, probably that was the wrong decision in the sense that probably led to the young prince's death. But anyway, that's very controversial about exactly what happened. Certainly, however, the common word in the early Tudor period was that, in a sense, Richard had tried to breach sanctuary, that had persuaded her to give up this child, and that had resulted in his death. So sanctuary should have been able to protect. She made a strategic error, and so sanctuary is a good thing in this scenario.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about Henry VII thinking about it being positive and being for political reasons, because while you're in there, kind of like taking refuge in an embassy, you can work on your case while you're in there and you can
That's
get
right.
yourself
Oh,
a good
absolutely.
defense.
Yeah. And that's what, I mean, in more prosaic terms, one of the reasons also, I think, that it came to be kind of embedded in the prosecution of felony, especially it became really a significant part of the system from, well, you can see it beginning to grow in the middle of the 15th century, but really it takes off in the 1480s, is that it's used a lot by upper, gentlemen and aristocrats who are involved in all kinds of violence with one another over, it's really kind of, politics was a dirty business that involved a lot of violence. A fair number of, kind of assassinations and that kind of thing are going on, but also that there are violent confrontations that sometimes end up with people dying. And so in other words, a lot of gentlemen get into legal trouble with homicides, and they find sanctuary extremely helpful for exactly the reason that you talked about, where it is, you kind of get yourself out of the sticky situation and you have a little bit of breathing room. And in that time when you have the breathing room, you can have an opportunity to call on your connections, who are then going to, in some way or another, kind of mediate your situation, that they're going to arrange for a pardon from the king. A lot of times, like the very common pattern is two gentlemen are fighting, one of them ends up dead. The perpetrator flees to sanctuary, sits there in sanctuary, and then a year and a half later, I see him back in court again. And he has a nice little pardon from the king that he has been able to organize over that year and a half. It takes a little while, because often you have to pay a big fine. So you have to get together the money for it and that kind of thing. But you need that year and a half where you're just going to, lounge about in sanctuary in order to do that. So if you don't have that time, in a high profile homicide case, often the justice actually moves pretty quickly. You'd be arrested and you might well be tried at the next sort of court sitting. And then once you've been convicted, there's no death row that you sit on for some long time. If you get convicted, then you are hanged, like literally usually the next day. So you want yourself not to get caught into that kind of very, the wheels turning very quickly. Sanctuary kind of allows you to get off of that merry-go-round and to be able to make your arrangements. And so sanctuary then ends up being a kind of supported by the high influence political classes. And I think that's one of the reasons why it then really becomes a standardized part of the criminal justice system for about, like, this late flowering is about 50 years or so where it's used a lot.
Yeah, and your work goes right into the Tudor period, as you're saying. You work till about 1550, is that right? So
That's right.
This is getting into the part where Henry VIII has split from the church. So what does this do to sanctuary?
Yeah, that's been a really big question amongst sanctuary scholars for a long time. I mean, actually, it didn't used to be a big question because people used to think that actually the answer is pretty easy, that this was a Catholic practice, and as soon as Henry leaves the church, then that's the end of sanctuary, that it just sort of goes off with the rest of the changes that take place at the Reformation. And in some senses that I still think, having, worked on this for the last decade or so, that in some ways that's still true, in the sense that sanctuary really falls off around 1535 when you're looking at the records of people who are seeking sanctuary. There's a really big dip right around then, which is, of course, right at the point where the Reformation in England is really beginning to kind of operationalize, I guess is a way to put it. But my argument is that it's actually not a deliberate killing because it's a Catholic practice, but rather it's a kind of collateral damage that takes place, a sort of accidental killing. There is a lot of sign, we don't have a huge amount of, unfortunately, of evidence about debates in Parliament and things like that about it. But there was an attempt in 1540 to create a new form of sanctuary. So the idea was, and this was what the statute actually attempted to do, was to create a new form of secularized sanctuaries. So the problem was that most sanctuary by the 1530s, well, actually pretty much all sanctuary by the 1530s, had morphed into the permanent sanctuary in the ecclesiastical precincts that are associated with the big churches and monasteries. And the problem was that, of course, the monasteries were all dissolved by 1540. And this meant that, in a sense, the infrastructure that had supported these places, in some places like Westminster Abbey was the most significant sanctuary in the realm. And we have a census for 1533 of the people who were in sanctuary, and there are around 90 people in sanctuary. So this is a significant, it's kind of like a prison in a sense. So the Abbey has within its precinct this very large number of people who are there, mostly felons, to take sanctuary. So, I mean, so what you need in order to have such a system is you need some kind of literal infrastructure, places for them to be, to stay, etc. And there are prisons, but they're not equipped for this kind of thing. And so in 1540, rather than facing this problem of, okay, now that we no longer have these monasteries, what are we going to do with these sanctuaries? They tried to create basically what they called sanctuary cities, which is sort of an interesting relationship in some ways with the current sanctuary city movement, where there would be a zone in 8 different cities around the realm, like a neighborhood basically that would be designated, this is the sanctuary neighborhood. And so sanctuary seekers would have to go and they would have to live in these neighborhoods. They would, have to be registered with probably the civic government, and that we would replace these old ecclesiastical sanctuaries. And the problem with that is that the cities in which these things were put, not surprisingly, had major NIMBY feelings, not in my backyard. And, there's justifiably, why would they want to have, why should this burden be put on them, is what they said, especially since, honestly, many of the people, I shouldn't say most, but a large number of the people who are seeking sanctuary are not urban people. There are these aristocrats and gentlemen who are not living in these cities. And so the cities don't want to deal with them. They're reluctant. And for whatever reason, and we can't quite, again, the records are very thin, but it becomes clear it just doesn't work, the new system. And very few people seem to have used it. We have very few records that, so it just appears as if there was an attempt to create a new system and it just didn't work. It could be that it was designed to fail, but actually I think it was just incompetently designed. I think that the people who were putting it into place were these gentlemen who were members of parliament, who actually did think this is a useful thing. Actually, quite a few, I shouldn't say that. Somewhere around 6 of the MPs in 1540 had themselves used sanctuary when they had committed a homicide earlier in their life. Then they'd gotten pardoned. And these gentlemen that go through this often fairly, when they're relatively young, they commit these homicides, they get the pardon, and then they go on with their political careers and they become MPs and they become sheriffs and they become justices of the peace. And so they thought it was helpful. I think they did want to try to devise something that would work, but really it just did not work. And it kind of just ends up petering out. I think that it was just a kind of accidental, as I said, collateral damage from the Reformation changes rather than a deliberate killing. So.
Yeah, I would think that people would be genuinely trying to make a system that worked, because if we look at the other stuff that they tried to build, systems, they wanted these systems to work. So I'd be with you on that. Just one question for my own curiosity. Did Mary try and bring that back when she came to power and tried to make England Catholic again? Did she bring sanctuary back?
Well, it's interesting that I don't think it was super high on her priority list, but yes. And actually the abbot of Westminster, he was very interested in this, and he did bring sanctuary back in the Westminster Abbey precinct. And so we do have a little bit of evidence of sanctuary at Westminster during Mary's reign. Obviously, her reign didn't last very long, it was only 5 years. And one of the things that then ended up happening is that it does associate sanctuary very firmly with Catholicism. And that ends up meaning that people become much less well disposed towards it. Obviously it's complicated, all of these things, but that didn't do it any favors. Let's just put it that way. It is interesting to compare what happens with sanctuary with what happened with the other very clearly ecclesiastical mitigation, which is benefit of clergy that you referred to earlier. Benefit of clergy had evolved by the 15th century so that any man, and again, it had to be a man, women were not eligible at this point for benefit of clergy, any layman who was literate and fit a few other technical things, but literacy was the main thing. You had to be able to read a passage from scriptures, and if you could read that passage, then you were handed over to the ecclesiastical officials rather than to royal justice for punishment. And because the church courts did not have capital punishment, in practice, by the 16th century, it meant that you would be imprisoned in one of the bishop's prisons or one of the ecclesiastical authorities' prisons. Bishops didn't much like this because now they had to run prisons that were more or less filled with people who were not actually priests, but who had been defined as clergy by the secular courts. And so this was, again, a kind of tricky thing. But benefit of clergy was, again, really useful for high status people because literacy was very class-based in terms of its spread. And so this was really helpful, again, for those high status people who were committing these various things. It was a way for them to get out of felony charges. Often, again, what would happen if you went, you claimed benefit of clergy, you went into the prison for a while, and that again was a place where somebody might be working on your behalf and you would end up with a pardon. So it's not unusual to see people who took benefit of clergy to end up with a pardon and then getting off. Now, that benefit of clergy survives the Reformation, and it gets mutated into something is quite different. It's kind of you get one get out of jail free card, depending on what precisely your crime was. You're only allowed to claim it once, but it ended up shifting so that if you were able to claim benefit of clergy, you could more or less be released. So the problems of the logistical issues of what to do with all of these prisoners was solved by actually just not putting them in prison. And so it was really useful. It was ecclesiastical in its origins, but it ended up by, in the later 16th, 17th, and it survives, I think, into the 19th century, but certainly through the 18th century, it ends up really being not ecclesiastical at all. It is just simply administered by the royal courts, and it really has nothing to do with the church. And I think that sanctuary could have gone that way. It could have developed, in a sense, into some kind of an incarceration system earlier than incarceration did end up developing, but it didn't. And, and I think that really it is kind of like just an accidental thing that nobody wanted to take responsibility, I guess, for it in the middle of the 16th century. And because of that, it ended up just dying effectively. It sort of limps along. There are sanctuaries for debt that do continue on through the 17th century into the 18th century, but not for felony, really.
Oh, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us about it, because I have learned so much. It's awesome. Thank you so much. People who want to learn more about the sanctuary cases that you're working on can follow your Twitter, right?
That's right. Yes. So I'm at Medieval McSheffrey, all one word. If people want to follow me on Twitter, I tweet out things about sanctuary. I have a sanctuary seeker of the day, so I try to do it, a number of times a week. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much, Shannon, for talking to us. It's been awesome.
Thanks, Danièle.
As Shannon mentioned, you can keep up with her work and even read about some of her sanctuary cases on Twitter at Medieval McSheffrey. That's Medieval, McSheff. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's new, Peter?
Hi, Danielle. Well, we got a little sad news to report this week. The death of Christopher Tolkien. He was the son and literary heir of J.R.R. Tolkien and responsible for bringing many of his father's works to publication, including the Silmarillion and a translation of Beowulf and other kind of academic pieces by the late J.R.R. Tolkien. So Christopher Tolkien now passed away. So you can read about that and his legacy. Plus, we have pieces on the Prussians, Sirens, and the new Netflix show called The Witcher.
Wow, that's a whole bunch of interesting stuff this week to check out.
Yeah, got a nice diversity here this week on medievalist.net.
Sounds good. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
This podcast is made possible by the support of our patrons at patreon.com. So if you love it, why not become one yourself? Patrons get all sorts of sweet deals like subscriptions to Medieval Warfare magazine, a monthly book through our book club with Boydell and Brewer, and an ad-free desktop version of medievalist.net. You can even be a part of the community for just $1 a month, and every cent is appreciated. Find it all at patreon.com/medievalists. I just want to take a quick moment to thank all of the people who have read my new book, Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, and taken a few moments to write a review on Amazon or Goodreads or your other bookstore website. We all know how much it helps to read a review before you buy something online, so I truly, truly appreciate it. If you've read the book and loved it, please let me know by tagging me on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist, or by leaving a review of your own. Thank you, all of you, for all your support. And finally, for more medieval goodness, you can always count on medievalists.net. You can follow medievalists.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and may you always find sanctuary when you need it.